Now, out of this system came the knights. The word knight means mounted horseman. There might have been something like it in Roman times. Basically, a knight was a son of a nobleman. You had to be of noble birth to become a knight. And also, it was extremely expensive to buy the armor, so you had to be a man of some wealth to become a knight. But to become a knight, again, you had to be a noble birth. You started out as a page boy. When you were 6, you were sent to the Lord's castle, or if you weren't there already, and the Lord would make you a page. You'd run errands for the local lord or run errands for the king. At about 14, you became a squire, and as a squire, you were a servant directly to a knight. And you served the knight in whatever he wanted done or needed done. And one of the things a squire had to do was get down on all fours so that his knight could mount a horse. This was before the invention of the stirrup. Now later the stirrup was invented, and this enabled knights to mount their horses without the help of a squire. But knights were the captains of the battlefield for many generations. It was not very often a knight in full armor got killed. The armor would protect them from arrows, from swords. What did the knights in later was the invention of the bullet, the invention of the cannonball. No armor could protect a knight from a heavy cannonball. And, but that was to come later. So the book says for almost 500 years, warfare in Europe would be dominated by the knights, or armored cavalry. Horse, armor, and weapons, all this was expensive. And also it took time to learn how to fight from horseback. I mean, the Japanese knights, samurai, had to learn how to shoot and bow and arrow from horseback. The knights had to learn to handle a spear and shield from the back of a horse, and this was not easy. It took some time, but eventually it was done. The lords would sometimes grant their vassals a plot of land known as a fief. Now, in this system, there was very little money. So it was a system of two that involved around two things, service and land. Service consisted of fighting. In other words, I will do your fighting for you if you'll protect me also. Service, again, mostly fighting. In the case of serf farming. And land, the knight would give his vassals some land and say, okay, you can have this land. It will still be my land, but you can work it and farm it and benefit from the produce of it. The land was called a fief. Fief, the land that the vassal would give to his, the land that the lord would give to his vassal was called a fief. Now, one of the things about this system, your book doesn't mention, but it was mentioned a lot, assassinations were rare. People would rarely rebel against their overlord, especially when their overlord was giving them protection or giving them land. So assassinations were very rare throughout the medieval period. And also fathers killing their sons was very, very rare also. You had it in the ancient world. You rarely had it during the medieval period. Now, your book goes on to describe the land system, otherwise known as the manorial system. The manor, the plot of land owned by the lord and farmed by the lord, was called the manor. Now, about the manor, no two of them were alike. Same with the castles. The lord typically lived in a castle. And no two castles that we've ever found were alike. But you'd have the castle, and then nearby the castle you'd have a village. You might have a pond and a mill, an oven and a press, the personal garden of the Lord, the Lord's hunting ground, called the Lord's close or whatever, and then the farms. Now, you'll notice the farms are long and narrow, look like strips of bacon. And the reason for this is the way they had to plow them. They plowed them with teams of horses, and they wanted the horse to move as much as he could before he had to turn around, because turning that team of horses around was a big task. So that get the horsemen, the plowers, to make a long, thin strip of these plowing. Then at some point when they got to the end of the field, they turned the horse around, turn the whole team around, and plow another strip. So that's why that your farms were typically like long strips of land. They also learned to rotate crops. Crop rotation, they rotate typically in threes, where that they'd have, let's say, I'm simplifying this, 1, 2, and 3. One year they'd plant maybe wheat on this crop. The next year maybe plant oats on this crop and move the wheat to this field here. In the meantime, the first year maybe this would lie idle. In other words, the land lay idle, unfarmed, at least once every few years. They learned that by letting land lie idle, they didn't know why, but to produce better when it was farmed again. Just simply. Now today we use fertilizers, but they did not know that much about fertilizers. But they did learn that we know why. But today, a certain crop might deplete all the minerals that this crop needs. So, but if you plant that same crop on a different field next year, and then about 3 years later, plant the same crop you did on this field 3 years later, the minerals will all be restored back to the soil. But they would rotate their crops generally in threes by letting 1/3 of their land lie idle and farm 2/3, but never plant the same crop on the same field 2 years back to back. And again, nowadays farmers have fertilizers that can put the minerals back in the soil that they need. Where this was the manorial system, the private land of the Lord's garden was sometimes known as the domain. It looks like it's spelled, but it's actually pronounced domain in this case. Some of these spellings in French and German look a little bit weird. Domain or domain. This was the land that the Lord would retain for his personal use. It would be farmed by the people at the bottom. Now, I want to comment about the people at the bottom. The persons at the bottom of the economic system were called serfs. Europe temporarily at least outlawed slavery. They felt like one Christian should not enslave another. So Christianity helped influence them to outlaw slavery, but they've been replaced instead with serfdom. The one big difference between a serf and a slave was a serf could not be bought or sold. So when a serf grew up on his, he'd be born on a certain nobleman's property, and he always remained property of that nobleman as long as he lived. He married someone typically who was also born on the same lord's property, and he would never be sold to another owner or forcibly moved to another field. Now, if the nobleman died or some other more powerful nobleman took over, the serf at least was still there to farm his own land. Serfs were not packed up and carried off to distant lands, but they remained, what you might say, bound to the soil. Most serfs were farmers. Serfs were usually not allowed to hunt. I must elaborate on hunting. So many of your poor people got in trouble for killing the king's deer, and the deer supposedly belonged to the king or the lords, and only the high nobility were allowed to hunt. And when my European ancestors moved to the New World, they said, we're not going to set up a system where only the rich can hunt. So they allowed everybody to hunt, even though, weirdly enough, it's gone out of style. My father tried to get me and my brothers interested in hunting, and none of us took it up. I care almost nothing about it. And the result is, the deer are multiplying against us, and this time of year, it's easy to hit them. I hit one myself 3 years ago, and it was in November. November, December, January are the worst months. And every time you drive along the road, you'll see one lying on the side who has obviously been hit by a car. And I had a woman working for an insurance firm here last year at this time, and she said, yes, that's a big, big problem, because a lot of their insurance is spent paying people who have hit deer and damaged a car from a deer. The animal that kills more humans than other animal these days is the deer. And we're not keeping them in check. We're not killing them. Nobody likes to hunt anymore. Nobody wants to hunt. I don't.
They're building in areas that were once rural where the deer were. Instead of removing the deer and then building, they're leaving them there and they have nowhere to go. And they try to stay where they know.
I will see them sometimes grazing, and you don't see them in the daytime. But if you're getting up as I do and leave my house before daylight, I sometimes see them grazing in the yard, just as if they belong there, like they're a cow or something.
They do
Because
belong
they
there.
were there.
They do belong there. It's their
Well,
land.
maybe they do belong there, yeah. But
Yeah, I
they're
got
grazing.
it.
One time I saw 5 of them grazing in a pasture. Next to Travis Tritt's place. I mean, to give you some idea.
I crushed a deer like 2 years ago in Congress.
What's that?
I said I crushed a deer in Congress 2 years ago.
You hit the deer?
Oh, yeah.
I hit one 3 years ago, knocked him down, and I thought my car was undamaged, but then I learned that the headlight was bent a little bit. The dealer, I learned later that I should have filed an insurance claim.
Well,
Yeah, they come
I got hit by one in Mableton.
Yeah.
When I'm very
My wife was against, she said, oh, they'll up your insurance. All the same, I've spent the rest of the time I owned that car with that headlight that was out of whack. And the dealer said, no, to fix, we have to wait till the headlight goes out. Today's headlights don't burn out. Hardly ever. I mean, maybe you think differently, but yeah, several of us have hit them. But again, we don't hunt. So we don't keep the numbers in check, and the result is they're multiplying against us pretty fast, and something will have to be done. It's difficult to fence them because they can jump a 30-foot fence. Really difficult to keep them fenced in or fenced out. Anyway, serfs were expected to give the best of their produce to the Lord. If they were allowed to fish, the best of their fish went to their Lord also, and the serf got what was left. Above the serfs were the freedmen. The free people were persons who were not serfs, but nevertheless not nobility. Now, the freedmen numbers increased as time went on. There's also a word you'll come across every time you study history, peasant. Now, I'm not sure what the definition of that word is. I know it has to do with a poor farmer, and I believe it means a farmer who does not own the land he's farming. He's too poor to afford his own land, so he farms for someone else. But then again, I've heard a different definition. But it's a farmer who generally does not own the land that he's farming. He farms for someone else and gets to keep a part of the produce, usually a small part of it.
Same as a sharecropper, in other words.
A lot of the same, sharecroppers would share the profits. So a bunch of them would farm a field and share the profits. The difference was, though, the peasant would turn all of his over to one landlord. That's the difference. So in the case of sharecroppers, they understood they split the profits. In the case of the peasant, he could keep what he produced, except give a big portion of it to his landlord, and then keep the rest.
And that's what I thought sharecropper.
Yeah, there might not be that much difference. The word peasant has never been used in American history, hardly ever used in American
I
history.
say it all the time.
You see it in American farming?
I say it.
Oh, you see it, okay. They were generally poor.